Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the events at Wanda Beach. Imagine the heavy stillness of a midsummer morning in Sydney. The year is 1965. The date is Monday, the 11th of January. The air is thick with the promise of a sweltering day, where the asphalt softens underfoot and cicadas provide a relentless soundtrack. We begin our journey in West Ryde, a quiet neighborhood where houses are modest and gardens are neatly kept. In the early morning light, the shadows are long and blue, stretching across parched lawns. The world feels safe, suspended in the slow pulse of a summer holiday. Breathe in the scent of dry grass. Let the modern world fade away until there is only the hum of the 1960s. These girls are Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock. They are both 15 years old, standing on the threshold of adulthood, yet still carrying the innocence of youth. They are best friends, a bond forged in the quiet proximity of being neighbors on Brush Road. Marianne is a girl of gentle strength, the second oldest of 7 children in a family that has seen hardship. Her family traveled from West Germany only 7 years prior, seeking a new life. Just a few months ago, they lost their father, Helmut, to illness. Now, with her mother Elizabeth in the hospital, the weight of the household rests on Marianne's shoulders. Beside her is Christine, who has chosen the stability of her grandparents' home. Together, they are a pair, inseparable and vibrant, their lives intertwined by shared secrets and summer dreams. Inside the Schmidt home, the air is filled with the happy energy of children preparing for an outing. The kitchen is small, the surfaces worn smooth. Marianne moves with grace, packing a lunch for the day. She prepares sandwiches of tomato and cucumber, wrapped in wax paper. She fills a thermos with cold lime green cordial, the ice cubes clinking against the metal sides with a rhythmic chime. Her younger siblings, Peter, who is 10, Trixie, who is 9, Wolfgang, who is 7, and little Norbert, only 5, are a whirl of excitement. They hunt for towels, buckets, and sun hats. The house smells of toasted bread and sun cream. There is a sense of responsibility in the way Marianne checks the children's shirts, ensuring they are ready for the long trek ahead. The screen door clicks shut as the group steps out into the mounting heat. They walk down Brush Road, the sun warm on their backs. Christine carries her own bag, her footsteps light beside Marianne's. They are a procession of 6, a small parade of summer joy moving toward Meadowbank Station. The children's voices are bright, cutting through the heavy morning air, while the teenagers talk in private tones. They pass rows of brick houses with wide porches, where a neighbor might be seen watering a rosebush before the sun becomes too fierce. The walk is not long, but the heat makes the distance feel significant. Every step takes them further from the sanctuary of their street, and closer to the rhythmic iron pulse of the railway line and the journey ahead. At Meadowbank Station, the platform is a slab of concrete shimmering in the haze. They wait for the train, the air smelling of hot oil. When it arrives, a rumbling beast of steel, the children scramble aboard with wide-eyed wonder. They find a carriage with green vinyl seats that feel sticky against the skin. Marianne and Christine sit together, the younger ones pressing their faces against the glass to watch the landscape blur into a smear of greens. The train carries them toward Redfern, the heart of the rail network. The rhythm of the tracks is hypnotic, a metal heartbeat that lulls the children into a swaying silence. Inside the carriage, the air is stagnant, moving only when the train gains speed and a hot breeze whistles through the open windows. At Redfern Station, they navigate the platforms to find the line heading south to Cronulla. The city feels vast, but the girls hold the children close. The final leg of the journey takes them through the southern reaches, where suburbs give way to glimpses of blue water. The air begins to change, taking on a sharp, brine-scented edge. By the time the train pulls into the station at Cronulla, it is nearing 11. The sun is at its zenith, a white-hot eye. As they step onto the platform, the light is blinding, reflecting off the white sand. They have arrived. The walk to the water is almost over, and the vast landscape of the coast stretches out before them. The day is theirs, as they begin the final stroll toward the shore. The golden glare of the afternoon began to surrender to a bruised and heavy sky. At Wanda Beach, the wind was no longer a gentle coastal breeze. It had sharpened, turning into a persistent, howling force that whipped the fine white sand into stinging clouds. It was 1965, a midsummer Monday that should have been defined by the scent of salt spray and the sound of laughter, but the atmosphere was shifting. The air grew thick with humidity, the kind of heavy stillness that precedes a southern storm. Along the dunes, the marram grass bent low, whispering against the sand as the light turned a strange, filtered shade of indigo. The vastness of the shoreline, which had felt so inviting only hours before, now seemed to stretch out into an endless, desolate gray. The ocean roared with a renewed aggression, its waves crashing against the rocks at the southern end, where the group had first sought shelter. Tucked away behind the high crest of a sandhill, 4 young children sat huddled together. Wolfgang, Norbert, Peter, and Trixie, the younger siblings of Marianne Schmidt, tried to block out the biting sand that pricked at their bare legs like 1,000 tiny needles. They had been left there with a transistor radio and a promise. Marianne and her best friend, Christine, had told them they would be back in just 20 minutes. They were only going to fetch the bags and purses from the rocks so the group could begin the journey home. But 20 minutes had dissolved into an hour, and then 2. The upbeat tunes from the radio felt increasingly out of place against the rising moan of the wind. The children watched the horizon, their eyes searching for the familiar silhouettes of the 2 15-year-old girls, but the dunes remained empty, shifting and sighing in the gale. As the hands of the clock crawled toward 5 o'clock, a quiet, collective decision was made among the younger ones. The shelter of the dune was no longer enough to keep out the cold that was creeping into the air. With their spirits dampened and their stomachs beginning to rumble, they stood up, brushing the grit from their clothes. They made the trek back to the southern rocks, half expecting to find Marianne and Christine waiting there, perhaps having shared a secret joke or a quiet conversation they hadn't wanted to interrupt. But when they reached the spot, the girls were not there. Only the bags remained, sitting precisely where they had been left, untouched by anyone but the wind. The children gathered the heavy vinyl purses and the towels, their movements slow and heavy with a confusion that hadn't yet sharpened into terror. The walk to Cronulla station was a blur of tired legs and mounting uncertainty. They arrived just in time to catch the 6 o'clock train, the last direct link back toward the city. As the carriage lurched into motion, the rhythm of the wheels against the tracks provided a hypnotic, metallic lullaby. The younger Schmidt children sat in a row, clutching the extra bags in their laps. They looked at the empty seats around them, seats that should have been occupied by 2 vibrant girls with their hair tangled by the sea and their hearts full of summer plans. The train moved north, leaving the churning surf of the Shire behind. Outside the windows, the suburban lights of Sydney began to flicker on, one by one, like small, distant stars in a darkening sea of trees and rooftops. Back in West Ryde, the evening silence of Brush Road was deep and suburban. At the Schmidt household, the air was uncharacteristically quiet. Their mother, Elizabeth, was away in the hospital recovering from an operation, leaving the eldest son, Helmut Jr., in charge of the home. He had spent the day keeping the house in order, occasionally glancing at the clock, expecting the front door to burst open with the chaotic energy of 5 returning siblings. When the 4 younger ones finally walked through the door at 8 o'clock, the silence they brought with them was heavy. They dropped the bags on the floor, their faces pale and etched with exhaustion. They explained that they had lost the girls at the beach. Helmut felt a cold prickle of unease. Marianne was responsible. She was the one who looked after everyone. For her to simply disappear was a crack in the foundation of their world. Next door, in the house where Christine Sharrock lived with her grandparents, the anxiety was reaching a breaking point. Jim and Janet had been watching the street from their window, waiting for the two best friends to come walking up the hill, arm in arm, as they always did. Christine was a girl of habit, a quiet soul who respected the boundaries of her home. When the news reached them that the younger children were back, but the teenagers were not, the grandmother's heart began to race. The two families, bound by proximity and now by a shared, growing dread, stood on the sidewalk in the twilight. They looked toward the end of the street, hoping for a miracle, but the only thing that greeted them was the distant rumble of thunder from the storm that had finally arrived. At 8:30 that evening, the decision was made to call the authorities. The telephone call was brief, but it changed everything. As the words were spoken into the receiver, the disappearance moved from a family matter to a police matter. The rain began to fall in earnest then, a heavy, tropical downpour that washed over the rooftops of West Ryde and lashed against the darkened dunes of Wanda Beach miles away. The families huddled in their kitchens, the tea growing cold in the pots, as the clock ticked toward midnight. Every sound outside, the screech of a car's brakes, the rustle of a neighbor's hedge, sent a jolt of hope through them, followed quickly by a crushing disappointment. The evening silence had been replaced by a night of agonizing questions, as two empty beds waited for girls who would never return to fill them. The sun rose over the Pacific on Tuesday, January 12th, 1965, with a heat that felt heavy and thick before the day had even truly begun. The previous night's desperate phone calls had left a lingering tension over the suburb of West Ryde, but at Wanda Beach, the morning appeared as any other summer morning would. The dunes were vast and undulating, a white-hot desert bordering the sapphire blue of the sea. The wind that had howled so fiercely the day before had settled into a low, warm hum, shifting the fine grains of sand across the peaks of the hills. It was a landscape of constant movement, where footprints vanished within an hour and the horizon shimmered under the weight of the climbing sun. In this quiet, desolate expanse, the shadows were long and sharp, hiding the secrets that lay buried just beneath the surface of the shifting white mountains. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, a young man named Peter Smith, who was only 17 years old, decided to take advantage of the summer heat. He was accompanied by his two young nephews, and together they set out for a walk through the sandhills. They were north of the Wanda Surf Club, wandering through the more secluded sections of the beach where the tourists rarely ventured. The boys were laughing, their feet sinking into the hot, powdery surface as they navigated the steep inclines of the dunes. To them, this was a playground of infinite possibilities. They weren't looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the freedom of the holidays and the salt-crusted air. But as they crested a rise in the sand, approximately 1,500 meters away from the safety of the clubhouse, the light caught something unusual in a shallow depression between two tall mounds. Peter slowed his pace, his eyes squinting against the glare of the sun. At first, he thought he was looking at a discarded store mannequin or perhaps a tailor's dummy that someone had left behind as a cruel prank. It sat partially buried, face down in the sand, the skin appearing strangely pale and waxy against the golden-white grains. There was a stillness to the object that felt unnatural, even for a beach so quiet. He approached with a cautious curiosity, the nephews trailing just behind him. He reached down and brushed away a small amount of the sand from the head, expecting the hard, hollow sound of plastic. Instead, he felt the cold, undeniable texture of reality. The shock was immediate and paralyzing. It was not a mannequin. It was the body of a young girl, her form partially reclaimed by the landscape, her life extinguished in a place that should have been a sanctuary of summer joy. The panic was a sharp, cold spike in the heat of the afternoon. Peter didn't stay to investigate further. The weight of the discovery was too much for a 17-year-old to bear. He gathered his nephews, his voice urgent and strained as he told them they had to leave. They ran back toward the Wanda Surf Club, their lungs burning as they navigated the difficult terrain of the dunes. Every step felt like it was in slow motion as the sand gave way beneath their feet. When they reached the club, Peter found the caretaker, a man named Bari. Gasping for breath, his face pale despite the sun, Peter managed to explain what he had seen. The authorities were contacted immediately. The call went out to the local police, and the quiet afternoon was suddenly shattered by the arrival of sirens and the heavy footsteps of investigators descending upon the sand. The first officers arrived from the Cronulla station, followed quickly by detectives from the scientific branch. They met Peter at the surf club and were led back through the heat to the site of the burial. As they stood over the depression in the sand, the gravity of the situation deepened. One of the officers noticed something even more chilling. He looked at the place where Peter had discovered the first girl and realized there were 3 feet protruding from the sand. The realization hit them like a physical blow. There were 2 bodies here, not one. The girls had been placed together in a final, tragic embrace, hidden by the very element they had come to enjoy. The police began the painstaking process of uncovering the remains, their movements slow and respectful, as they worked under the relentless glare of the Australian summer sun. The scene was a chaotic tapestry of violence and mystery. Detectives documented long drag marks in the sand, stretching for 34 meters, suggesting that at least one of the girls had tried to flee before being caught and brought back to the hollow. Scattered around the bodies were the mundane remnants of a day at the beach: notebooks, a blanket, and items of clothing that had been tossed aside in the struggle. The shifting wind was a constant enemy, threatening to erase the footprints and the delicate evidence that lay in the dust. The police moved to seal the perimeter, stretching yellow tape across the crests of the dunes, effectively turning the beautiful, sun-drenched beach into a fortress of investigation. The news of the discovery began to ripple through the community, turning the hope of the previous night into a dark, heavy grief that would settle over Sydney for decades to come. As the afternoon light began to soften into amber, the officers sifted through tons of sand, looking for anything that might lead them to a suspect. They found a broken knife blade, a piece of metal that hummed with the violence of the crime, yet no handle could be found nearby. The isolation of the spot was now its most terrifying feature. It was a place where screams would be swallowed by the roar of the surf and the whistling wind. The girls, Marianne and Christine, were no longer just names on a missing persons report. They were the center of a horrific puzzle that would involve thousands of interviews and become the largest investigation in the history of the country. For now, however, there was only the sound of the ocean and the grim work of the men in uniform, standing on the edge of a mystery that was only just beginning to unfold. The task for the investigators was now to build a bridge back to the previous day. They had to walk where the girls had walked, to see what they had seen, and to understand the rhythm of their final hours. It was a Monday, the 11th of January, 1965. The sun had risen over Sydney with a heavy promise of heat, but the air was thick with a restless energy, the kind that precedes a sudden change in the season. Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock, both 15 years of age, were inseparable. They were neighbors from the suburb of West Ryde, young women enjoying the last stretch of the summer holidays. On that morning, they had gathered Marianne's 4 younger siblings to make the trip to the coast. They left the house around 8:30, a morning filled with the sounds of a busy family. Imagine the clatter of shoes on the wooden porch and the excitement of the younger children. They made their way to the train station, catching the carriage that would carry them across the city to Cronulla. The journey took over an hour, rhythmically drumming along the tracks with the smell of warm upholstery. They arrived at the station around 11 o'clock. Stepping onto the platform, they were greeted not by a calm summer breeze, but by a fierce, buffeting wind. The flags at the beach were down. The surf was too dangerous, and the beach was closed. It was a disappointment, but the group decided to stay, walking toward the southern end of the beach to seek refuge among the rocks. By mid-morning, the group had settled. They shared a picnic, the taste of salt already on their lips. But children are often restless, and the heat was mounting despite the wind. The girls decided to head toward the shops to get something more. They were seen at the Wanda Milk Bar around 1 o'clock. Picture the scene, the cool interior of the shop, a stark contrast to the white sand outside. There was the familiar hum of the deep fryers and the sweet smell of the milkshake machines. They may have bought food, their hands warmed by the golden pastry, or perhaps bottles of cold soda that sweated in the humidity. Witnesses recalled seeing them, 2 teenage girls in summer clothes, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that they were among the last to see them alive. After their small meal, they returned to where the younger children were waiting behind a protective ridge of sand. The wind was growing stronger now, whipping the fine grains into miniature cyclones. Marianne and Christine then made a decision that would later haunt the investigators. They told the younger boys to stay put, saying they were going to head back to the southern rocks to fetch their bags. They promised they would return shortly, and then they would all head home together. But as the younger brothers watched them walk away, they noticed something strange. The girls did not head south toward the rocks where their belongings lay. Instead, they turned and began walking north. They were heading toward the desolate, towering dunes of the Wanda Wilderness, a place where the landscape shifted into peaks. The sky was no longer blue. It had turned a bruised, heavy shade of charcoal as a summer squall swept in from the sea. The first drops of rain would have been large and cold, splashing against the hot sand and releasing that earthy, metallic scent of a storm. A witness named Dennis, who was also out that day, reported a final, haunting sighting. He saw the 2 girls near the edge of the dunes, about 800 meters from the area where they would eventually be found. He noted that one of the girls kept glancing back over her shoulder, as if someone was behind them, as if they were being followed through the mist. But the rain was coming down harder now, a gray curtain falling over the coast. They continued forward, their figures growing smaller and smaller against the sand. In that deluge, the world became a place of shadows and sound. The roar of the ocean mingled with the hiss of the rain on the sand. The younger siblings waited for hours as the temperature dropped and the afternoon faded into a wet evening. They called out, their voices swallowed by the wind, but there was no answer. By 5 o'clock, the children realized the girls were not coming back. They gathered the bags and took the long train ride home alone, arriving in the dark of 8 o'clock. Behind them, at the beach, the storm had washed away every trace of their footprints. Marianne and Christine had vanished into the dunes, leaving behind a silence that would not be broken until the following morning. The sand, ever shifting and indifferent, began to settle over the secrets of their final, lonely moments in the rain. Siblings, huddled together against the stinging bite of the wind-blown sand, watched as the 2 older girls drifted further away into the undulating architecture of gold and shadow that defined the Wanda Dunes. On that Monday in January 1965, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the scorched earth while the wind tore at the crests of the hills. As Marianne and Christine moved away from the relative safety of the group, the landscape seemed to swallow them whole. To an observer standing on the distant shoreline, the girls would have appeared as 2 small, bright points of color against an increasingly desolate and shifting backdrop. It is here, in this wide, bright expanse, that the mystery of the man on the horizon begins to take shape. For decades, investigators would pore over the accounts of those who were on the beach that day, trying to sharpen the blurred edges of a memory that refused to stay still. The wind was a thief, carrying away voices and blurring tracks, but it could not erase the haunting image of the figure who walked in their wake. Around 12:45 in the afternoon, A local man named Dennis Dostine was walking along the sandhills with his young son. Dennis was a fireman, a man trained by profession to notice the subtle details of his environment, to look for things that were out of place or inherently dangerous. He was roughly 800 yards north of the Wanda Surf Club when he spotted the two girls. They were walking quickly, their pace suggesting a sense of purpose that felt slightly at odds with the typical languid stroll of a summer holiday. But what caught his eye was not just their speed. It was the way they moved in relation to the world behind them. One of the girls, believed to have been Marianne, kept glancing over her shoulder. It was a sharp, repetitive motion, a look not of curiosity, but of checking. She was measuring the distance between themselves and whatever lay in the heat shimmer of the dunes, a silent calculation of safety that was rapidly diminishing as they moved deeper into the isolation of the hills. Trailing behind them, like a ghost following its own shadow, was a silhouette that would come to haunt the Australian consciousness. Witnesses would later describe him with agonizingly vague adjectives that created a phantom rather than a person. He was tall, he was thin. He was a youth, perhaps no older than 16 or 17, though some thought he might have been in his early 20s. He was dressed in a way that seemed almost too ordinary for the scene, a light-colored shirt and dark trousers. Against the blinding white of the dunes and the deep, restless blue of the Pacific, he was a dark line, a vertical break in the horizontal world of the beach. Some accounts placed him walking directly between the girls, as if they were a trio of friends sharing a summer secret. Others saw him lingering several yards back, a silent shadow that mimicked their every turn through the undulating, sun-bleached hills of the Wanda sand dunes, never closing the gap, but never falling behind. The tragedy of these descriptions lies in their utter lack of definition. To some, he had light hair that caught the glare of the sun. To others, it was dark and matted with salt. This discrepancy was not a failure of the witnesses, but a testament to the oppressive environment of Wanda Beach itself. The air was thick with salt spray and fine, stinging particles of sand that irritated the eyes and clouded the vision. The sun was at its zenith, casting short, confusing shadows and creating mirages that made distant figures seem to float above the scorched ground. When the police eventually began their massive inquiry, interviewing over 14,000 people, this thin, tall figure became the center of a psychological storm. He was the ghost of the dunes, a person who was seen by many but known by none. He was the boy who never came forward, the witness who never spoke, or perhaps the predator who knew exactly how to blend into the merciless glare of the afternoon. There were other shadows on the sand that day, equally strange and unsettling in the light of what was to come. One man was seen sunbathing with a large piece of corrugated iron held over his head. At first, this was viewed with deep suspicion by the public, a makeshift shield for a voyeur, perhaps, or a bizarre mask for a monster. Yet, as the investigation deepened, the mundane reality of the weather offered a different, more practical perspective. The wind was so fierce, and the sand so biting that a person might do anything to find a moment of peace. Then there was the report of a man carrying a radio over his shoulder, a figure who reportedly approached other women on the beach to speak of inappropriate things. These fragmented portraits of strangers highlight the chaotic and crowded nature of the day. The beach was full of life, yet the dunes remained a labyrinth where a person could disappear within 20 yards of the main path, swallowed by the silence of the hollows. One of the most promising leads early in the search involved a teenager who was found at a nearby beach with blood-stained trousers. The news of his detention sent ripples of cold hope through the community, a fleeting belief that justice would be swift and the nightmare would end. But the blood had a simple, tragic explanation, and the boy was soon released. The surfing teen became another dead end in a case that was quickly becoming a collection of them. The investigation was hampered from the start by the very nature of the crime scene. The wind that the girls had tried to escape was also the wind that buried the physical evidence of their passing. By the time the search parties arrived the next morning, the shifting sands had moved significantly, covering the tracks of the girls and their pursuer, leaving only the fading memory of a tall, thin man standing on the edge of the world, watching and waiting. We are left to wonder about those final moments when the giggles the younger brothers heard turned into a heavy, suffocating silence. The man on the horizon was not a ghost, but a man of flesh and bone who walked through the same heat and felt the same salt on his skin. He watched the girls leave the safety of the group. He followed them into the silence of the high dunes, where the sound of the waves is muffled by the massive weight of the sand, and the wind screams loud enough to drown out any other sound. As we look back through the decades, that figure remains there, etched into the history of 1965. He is a permanent fixture of the landscape, a tall, thin silhouette forever walking toward the girls, forever out of reach, a reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the brightest, most beautiful light of a summer afternoon. The horizon holds its secrets tightly, buried beneath the weight of 1,000 shifting tides. The sun rose on the morning of January 12th, 1965, over a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by the violent winds of the night before. As the heat began to shimmer over the Wanda sandhills, a local man named Peter Smith was walking with his 3 young nephews. They were exploring the dunes, perhaps looking for treasures the sea might have surrendered to the shore. But instead of shells, they saw something that stopped them. It looked, at first glance, like a discarded store mannequin, partially buried face down in the white grit. It was a surreal sight in such a desolate place, an object out of context. But as Peter stepped closer, the salt-heavy air grew colder. The realization hit him with the force of a blow. This was no plastic figure. This was a nightmare. The forensic investigation was a monumental task, hampered by the technology of 1965. Back then, the tools were far more rudimentary than today. There was no database of genetic codes to search, no high-resolution cameras to capture every microscopic fiber. Instead, the New South Wales police were faced with a shifting, chaotic scene. The wind had been a relentless enemy, gusting at more than 30 knots throughout the previous evening. It had blown fresh layers of sand over the bodies, creating a natural shroud that obscured the timeline of the attack. Every grain was a potential piece of evidence, yet every grain was also a moving target. In the eyes of the law, the beach was a silent witness that refused to give up its secrets, leaving investigators to work with their hands and their instincts in the blinding sun. Detectives found the 2 girls positioned with a haunting, tragic proximity. Marianne Schmidt was lying on her side, her leg bent as if caught mid-stride. Just below her, face down in the sand, lay Christine Sharrock. Her head was resting against Marianne's foot, a final connection between 2 friends who had shared everything. The most chilling detail was a long, deep furrow in the sand, a drag mark that stretched for 34 meters. This scar on the earth told a story of desperate survival. It suggested that Christine had somehow broken free, that she had run into the dunes, her lungs burning with salt and fear, only to be caught, overpowered, and dragged back to the spot where her friend lay. The thought of those 34 meters, and the terror felt in those final moments, is almost unbearable. To find the weapons, a sharp knife and a heavy, blunt instrument, the police turned to an exhaustive method of sifting. They brought in mechanical sieves and an army of officers to process tons of the surrounding sand. It was a painstaking, back-breaking labor. Every shovelful was examined for a glint of steel. During this effort, they did find a blood-stained knife blade buried deep beneath the surface. For a moment, hope went through the investigation, but forensic testing would later prove that the blade could not be linked to the murders. It was a cruel tease from the dunes, a piece of unrelated refuse that happened to be in the wrong place. The actual murder weapons had vanished, likely tossed into the churning surf where the Pacific Ocean would bury them deeper than any shovel could ever reach. The search for fingerprints was equally frustrating. In the 1960s, the science of lifting prints was well established, but sand is an unforgiving surface. The coarse, loose grains cannot hold the delicate oils left by a human hand. The killer had left no trace of his identity on the bodies themselves, and any marks on the items were scoured away by the abrasive wind. The girls' personal belongings, their purses, towels, and tickets, had been left back with the younger siblings. This meant the girls walked into the dunes with almost nothing but the clothes on their backs. This lack of physical evidence created a void the police struggled to fill. Without a weapon, without a fingerprint, and without a witness to provide more than a vague description, the investigation began to lean on the tiny biological clues left behind. As the sun set on that first day, the scale of the challenge became clear. The sandhills of Wanda were not just a place of beauty, but a labyrinth of evidence and absence. The items left behind, the scattered clothing, the shallow depressions, only pointed to a struggle as brief as it was brutal. The silence of the beach was now filled with the hum of machines and the low murmurs of detectives, yet the core of the mystery remained untouched. They were looking for a ghost in a landscape that changed with every breeze. The sand continued to shift, a rhythmic movement that seemed to mock the efforts of those trying to find justice. It was a puzzle where the pieces were made of dust. The largest manhunt in Australian history would soon begin, but the only certainty was the loss. The sun that rose over Cronulla on the morning of January 12, 1965, seemed to carry a different weight. The previous afternoon had been one of salt spray and the lightheartedness of summer, but as news of the discovery at Wanda Beach rippled through the suburbs, the warmth of the season began to feel hollow. For the people of New South Wales, the Golden Dunes were no longer just a place for picnics and surf. They had become a sprawling, shifting crime scene. The transformation of the town happened almost in an instant. In the quiet streets of West Ryde, where the two girls had lived as neighbors and best friends, a heavy, suffocating silence took hold. The energy of the mid-60s was suddenly punctured by an unimaginable brutality. The scale of the police response was unprecedented, a massive machine of justice grinding into motion. Hundreds of officers descended upon the sandhills, their dark uniforms creating a stark, somber contrast against the pale, wind-swept landscape. It was a search of agonizing precision. Detectives and volunteers spent hours sifting through the fine grains of sand, looking for anything that might have been left behind in the struggle. A button, a scrap of fabric, or the discarded weapon that had caused such devastation. Every inch of the dunes, which stretched out like a desolate wilderness, was scrutinized under the harsh Australian sun. This was the beginning of what would become the largest investigation in the history of the state. The sheer logistics of the operation were staggering, as the shifting nature of the beach itself was their greatest adversary, constantly swallowing clues beneath the tide. Within the walls of the police stations, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper and the constant, rhythmic clatter of typewriters. Detectives began the task of interviewing anyone who had been near the beach that fateful Monday. By the following year, the number of people questioned would surpass 7,000. It was an investigation that seemed to touch every corner of the community. They looked for the surfer youth described by witnesses, a shadow in the dunes who had remained unidentified. They cataloged 5,000 names, 5,000 possible lives that had to be picked apart and examined for a single thread of truth. Each interview was a fragment of a larger, more terrifying puzzle. The files grew, a paper trail of a town trying to find a monster hidden in plain sight, while the reward of £10,000 went unclaimed. For the families of Cronulla and the surrounding suburbs, the psychological impact was profound and permanent. It was the end of an era of innocence. Before that January day, Children had wandered the beaches with a sense of total freedom, and doors in the quiet avenues of West Ryde were often left unlocked. But now, as the shadows lengthened, the sound of deadbolts sliding into place became a new evening ritual. Parents watched their children with a fierce, newfound vigilance. The beach, once a symbol of the great Australian dream, was now viewed with a lingering suspicion. There was a sense that the world had become a smaller, more dangerous place. The Wanda wilderness was no longer a playground. It was a site of trauma that haunted the collective memory of an entire generation. The investigation felt like a race against time, yet time was the very thing that seemed to be eroding the evidence. The forensic techniques of 1965 were a world away. Detectives relied on physical intuition and the hope of a breakthrough witness. They studied the black and white photographs of the scene, the images capturing the haunting stillness of the sand where the two 15-year-old girls were found. The details were kept behind closed doors, but the brutality was whispered about in every corner store and train carriage. The community's grief was intertwined with a deep, gnawing frustration. How could such a massive effort, thousands of statements, hundreds of leads, and the constant attention of the national media yield so little? The mystery of Wanda Beach began to settle into the bones of the city, a cold case that refused to be forgotten. As the weeks turned into months, the frenzy of the investigation slowed into a persistent search for answers that remained just out of reach. The town had been transformed from a carefree coastal retreat into a place defined by its secrets. Every man seen walking alone in the dunes became a subject of scrutiny. Every unfamiliar car sparked a flicker of alarm. The girls, Marianne and Christine, were remembered not just as victims, but as the moment when a nation realized that evil could find its way into the most beautiful of places. The sand continued to shift, wind blowing over the dunes, but the psychological scars would never truly heal, remaining as deep as the sandhills themselves. As the midsummer heat of 1965 pressed down on the coast of New South Wales, the investigation into the deaths of Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock transformed from a frantic search into a sprawling, heavy-lidded machine. The initial shock had crystallized into a persistent, humming tension that vibrated through the streets of Cronulla. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the rhythmic clacking of typewriters that never seemed to rest. Every window was thrown open to catch a breeze that refused to come, and the detectives worked in shirt sleeves, their brows damp as they sifted through a mountain of reports. The net was being cast wider than ever before, stretching across the sun-drenched beaches and into the dusty camps of those who lived on the fringes of society. It was a search for a phantom, a silhouette seen in the shifting sands, and the pressure to find a face to match the horror was becoming an almost physical weight. The focus shifted heavily toward the subculture that defined the shoreline. In those days, the beach was a sanctuary for the young and the restless, a place where surfboards and salt-bleached hair were the markers of a carefree existence. But now, every young man with a tan and a board was a person of interest. The police began to scrutinize the so-called beach bums who spent their days riding the breaks at Wanda and their nights sleeping in the dunes or in battered vans parked along the esplanade. They were looking for a specific type of youth, a surfer with a certain build who had been glimpsed near the girls before they vanished. Two young men, known only as Ted and Jim, were pulled into the light of the interrogation room. They had been seen laughing and sharing innocent moments with Marianne and Christine on New Year's Day, just 10 days before the tragedy. The detectives pressed them for hours, searching for a crack in their stories, but their alibis held firm like a steady tide. They were eventually cleared, leaving the police to look back toward the shifting crowds and the strangers who left no footprints. Beyond the local surfies, a more shadow-filled demographic began to draw the attention of the New South Wales police. This was the world of the itinerant workers, the men who drifted from town to town, following the promise of seasonal labor or simply moving because the horizon called to them. These men were ghosts in the system, often staying in boarding houses or temporary camps, their pasts as murky as the deep water beyond the reef. The police began a systematic sweep of these transient communities, questioning thousands of individuals. They looked for men with scratches on their faces, men who seemed overly anxious when a uniform appeared, or men who could not account for their movements on that fateful Monday. One lead took them to Coogee Beach, where rumors swirled about a teenager seen with blood-stained trousers. The news of his detention sent a ripple of electricity through the public, a hope that the nightmare was ending. But like so many other leads in those early months, the explanation was mundane and unrelated to the violence at Wanda. The boy was released, and the detectives were forced back to their files, their pens scratching against paper in the quiet of the night. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented in Australian history. By the time the investigation reached its peak, nearly 7,000 people had been formally interviewed. Think of that number for a moment. 7,000 individual lives, 7,000 sets of movements to verify, 7,000 stories to cross-reference against the timeline of two 15-year-old girls. The files grew so large they required their own dedicated space, a library of suspicion that filled room after room. Investigators traveled across the country, following tips that lead to remote outposts and bustling cities, but the core of the mystery remained tethered to the sandhills. There was a growing realization that the killer might not be a local fixture or a well-known drifter, but someone who possessed a terrifying ability to blend into the scenery. A man who could walk among the crowds at the surf club, watch the sunset, and then slip away into the darkness without a second glance from the passers-by. The police were looking for a needle in a haystack made of human beings. As the months passed, the profiles of the primary suspects began to take on more specific, darker shapes. While the beach bums and the laborers provided a broad pool of interest, certain individuals started to stand out due to their history or their proximity to the crime. There was talk of a man seen wandering the dunes with a strange intensity, a figure that some witnesses called the Wanderer. Others spoke of a young man with a distinct, unsettling gaze who had been seen in the area frequently, but never seemed to belong to any particular group. The detectives began to look for patterns in other unsolved cases, wondering if the person who took Marianne and Christine had struck before, or if they were watching a predator find his footing. Every piece of clothing found in the scrub, every discarded knife, and every scrap of paper was treated as a potential key to the lock. The community was on edge, parents clutching their children's hands a little tighter as they walked past the dunes, sensing that the person responsible was still out there, perhaps even standing among them as they searched for answers. The frustration of the New South Wales police was palpable. They had processed thousands of names, checked hundreds of alibis, and followed every whisper that blew in with the salt spray. Yet, the primary suspect remained a ghost. The early leads, though exhaustive, seemed to only highlight how easy it was to disappear in the vastness of the Australian coast. The itinerant workers moved on to the next town, the surfers returned to the waves, and the list of names in the police files grew cold under the weight of the unsolved. But even as the trail seemed to vanish into the wind, a few names began to surface that would haunt the investigation for decades to come. Names of men whose paths would later cross with other horrors, leading many to wonder if the answers had been right in front of them all along, hidden in the sheer volume of the search. For now, the files remained open, the pages turning slowly in the humid air, as the town of Cronulla waited for a breakthrough that felt as distant as the stars over the Tasman Sea. The investigation into the Wanda Beach murders had become a labyrinth of yellowing documents and fading memories. The New South Wales police had processed thousands of names, but as the 60s bled into the 70s, The trail seemed to be vanishing into the very sand that had claimed Marianne and Christine. However, in a different state, under a different set of circumstances, a name began to surface that would cast a long, dark shadow over every unsolved crime against children in Australia. Derek Ernest Percy. He was not a man who looked like a monster in the traditional sense. He was a naval rating, someone who stood for order and service. But beneath that uniform was a mind fractured and filled with a specific, ritualistic brand of violence that mirrored the horrors found in the dunes of Cronulla. To the investigators, he was a ghost that finally had a face. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came in July 1969. In the small town of Warneet, a 12-year-old girl named Yvonne Chewy was abducted from a beach at knife point. The crime was witnessed by her young friend, who courageously provided the police with a description of the attacker's vehicle. An orange Datsun station wagon with a distinctive naval sticker on the window. Within hours, detectives tracked the car to the naval base at Crib Point. There, they found Derek Percy, then 21 years old, machine washing his blood-soaked clothes. The mechanical hum of the washing machine was a chilling backdrop to the discovery of a killer caught red-handed. Though he was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murder of Yvonne, the nature of his crime was so depraved that it forced investigators to look backward, far beyond the events of that winter afternoon. As the police delved into Percy's life, they uncovered a history of escalating darkness. From a young age, he had been fascinated by the sight of blood and the mutilation of dolls. His parents had found and destroyed graphic journals he had written as a teenager, but the writings he produced later in life survived. These journals were a descent into a hellish landscape of sadistic fantasies, detailed with a clinical, detached precision. He wrote of abductions, of the sea, and of the control he craved over his victims. In his youth, he had been known as a peeping Tom and a thief of women's clothing, a snowdropper, as the local papers called the anonymous culprit. This progression from petty theft to extreme violence is a hallmark of the most dangerous offenders, and it made the detectives wonder if the Wanda Beach murders had been his true, horrifying beginning. The connection to Wanda Beach was not just psychological, it was geographical. In January 1965, at the age of 15, Percy had been visiting his friend's grandparents in Ryde, the very same suburb where Marianne and Christine lived. He was in the area, a quiet teenager with a camera, drifting through the crowds. Witnesses at Wanda Beach had reported seeing the two girls talking to a fair-haired youth who carried a knife in a sheath. When investigators compared the old identikit sketches to photos of a teenage Percy, the resemblance was unsettling. He had the same long, lean face and the same cold, distant gaze. Though he was young, the sheer brutality of the Wanda Beach crimes, the multiple stab wounds and the specific positioning of the bodies, matched the ritualistic nature of the violence Percy would later admit to in 1969. It felt like a signature written in the sand. For more than 40 years, Derek Percy was held at Her Majesty's pleasure, becoming the longest-serving prisoner in the state of Victoria. He was a ghost in the system, a man who the authorities deemed too dangerous to ever walk free. Psychiatrists who interviewed him over the decades described him as a vault of secrets. He was polite, almost robotic, yet he possessed a chilling lack of empathy. Detectives from all over the country would visit him in his high-security cell, showing him photographs of missing children. The Beaumont siblings from Adelaide, little Alan Redston from Canberra, and of course, Marianne and Christine. They hoped that the passage of time or the weight of his own mortality would crack his resolve. But Percy remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his involvement, enjoying the final, cruel power of withholding the truth from the grieving families who only wanted peace. As the new millennium dawned, forensic science offered a glimmer of hope. In 2012, a weak male DNA profile was extracted from a pair of shorts belonging to one of the victims. but the sample was too degraded to provide a definitive match to Derek Percy. The shadow remained, unyielding. In July 2013, Percy was dying of lung cancer in a hospital bed. Detectives made one final attempt to obtain a deathbed confession, hoping he would finally clear the air of the mysteries that had haunted Australia for nearly half a century. But as his breathing slowed and the machines hummed, he remained a mystery to the end. He died at the age of 64, taking the answers to the grave and leaving the cold dunes of Wanda Beach to keep their secrets for another generation. The shadow remains, cast perpetually across the white sands of the South. As the final years of the 20th century faded away, the silence surrounding the sand dunes of Wanda Beach felt heavier than ever. Decades had passed since that overcast afternoon in 1965, and the world had transformed. The quiet, coastal outskirts of Cronulla were now bustling suburbs, and the children who had played in the sand that day were now grown, carrying the weight of a mystery that refused to be solved. But inside the archives of the New South Wales Police, the case was far from forgotten. In the year 2000, a dedicated cold case unit was tasked with looking back into the shadows. They began by pulling the original files, those thick, yellowing manila folders filled with typed statements and grainy black and white photographs. The air in the evidence room was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the salt-whipped heat of the beach where the tragedy had unfolded. For the investigators, this was a journey back in time, navigating the ghosts of 1,000 failed leads and the echoes of 7,000 interviews that had once led to nothing but dead ends. The focus of this new era was not just on rereading old testimony, but on the silent witnesses that had been locked away in evidence lockers for over 35 years. These were the physical remnants of a nightmare, the clothing worn by Marianne Schmidt and Sharrock. In the early 2000s, forensic science was beginning to perform what seemed like miracles. DNA profiling, once a futuristic concept, was now a bridge to the past. Detectives and scientists looked at the preserved garments with a mixture of reverence and intense pressure. They knew that within the fibers of a cotton shirt or the seams of a pair of shorts, a single microscopic cell could hold the identity of a killer. Every movement was careful and deliberate. They worked under sterile lights, wearing protective gear to ensure that no modern trace would contaminate the fragile legacy of the 1960s. It was a slow, methodical process of waiting for technology to catch up with the sheer brutality of the crime. The investigators focused their attention on a pair of white shorts that had belonged to Sharrock. These shorts had been through the harsh environment of the dunes, exposed to the elements before being recovered and stored away. For years, they had sat in the dark, but in the laboratory, they were subjected to the most advanced testing available. Scientists were searching for what they called touch DNA or biological fluids that had survived the passage of 4 decades. The difficulty was immense. Biological material degrades over time, especially when it has been exposed to the salt and moisture of a coastal environment. Yet, the team persisted. They used specialized light sources to scan the fabric, looking for the faintest glow that might indicate a secret left behind by the perpetrator. It was a hunt for a ghost, a search for a genetic signature that had been hidden in the weave of the fabric since that terrible Monday in January so many years ago. In February of 2012, a flicker of light appeared in the darkness. The cold case unit announced a significant development that sent ripples through the Australian public. Forensic analysts had successfully extracted a male DNA profile from those white shorts. It was described as a weak profile, fragmented and partial due to the extreme age of the sample, but it was undeniably male. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the police had a physical piece of the killer's identity. This was no longer just a description of a blonde surfer or a man in a dark suit. It was a biological code. However, the victory was bittersweet. Because the profile was so weak, It could not be immediately run through a database to find a perfect match. It was a whisper of a name rather than a clear shout. The technology of 2012 was a massive leap forward, yet it still stood on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a mystery that was almost, but not quite, within reach. While the discovery of the profile on the shorts offered a new path, the investigation was simultaneously struck by a devastating blow. As the team sought to compare this new evidence with other samples collected in 1965, they discovered a heartbreaking gap in the records. A crucial biological sample taken from Marianne Schmidt's body during the original autopsy. A sample that could have provided a much stronger DNA profile was missing. By July of 2014, the police were forced to admit that despite an exhaustive search of every laboratory, hospital, and warehouse in the state, the sample could not be found. It had been lost somewhere in the labyrinth of the past, likely during a period when the importance of long-term forensic storage was not fully understood. The loss felt like a second theft of justice for the Schmidt family. To have the answers so close, only to realize that a vital piece of the puzzle had vanished into the ether, was a heavy burden for the modern detectives to carry. Despite this setback, the partial profile from the shorts remained a potent tool. It became a benchmark against which the primary suspects could finally be measured. Men like Derek Percy, who was already serving time for the horrific murder of a child and was suspected of many more, were now squarely in the crosshairs of science. Percy had died in 2013, but his DNA had been preserved. Other names from the past, including those who had long since passed away, were revisited with a new intensity. The goal was to see if the ghost on the shorts shared any traits with the monsters of the mid-20th century. The investigators knew they were racing against time as witnesses grew older and memories continued to blur. Every breakthrough in genetic genealogy and every refinement in forensic testing brought them a step closer to the truth. They were no longer just looking for a man. They were looking for a match, hoping that the small, degraded sample would one day find its voice and finally name the shadow from the dunes. Imagine the sound of the wind whipping across the crests of the sandhills, a low, rhythmic moan that never truly ceases. The Darrell people named this place Wanda, a word that simply means beach or sandhill. It is a place where the Kurnell Peninsula meets the restless Pacific, defined by fine, pale sand that shifts with every breeze. On a bright summer afternoon, the sun reflects off the grains with a brilliance that is almost blinding. But as evening falls, shadows stretch long and thin over the valleys. It is in these quiet, shifting spaces that the memory of two young girls still lingers. The dunes act as a silent guardian of secrets, where the ground beneath your feet today may be buried deep by tomorrow, forever changing the shape of the shore. The mystery of Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock is woven into the fabric of these dunes. On the 11th of January, 1965, a tragedy unfolded that would haunt Australia for generations. In the months that followed, the police embarked on the largest investigation in the country's history. Detectives interviewed more than 7,000 people, desperate to find a single thread that would lead them to the person responsible. A reward of £10,000 was offered, which was later converted to $20,000 in 1966. Yet, despite the massive scale of the search and the intensity of the public's fear, the dunes refused to yield their secret. The investigation eventually cooled, settling into the archives as New South Wales' oldest unsolved homicide, a cold case that refuses to stay silent in the salt air. One name has cast a longer shadow over this case than any other. Derek Ernest Percy was a man whose life was defined by darkness and a terrifying lack of empathy. When he was arrested in 1969 for a different crime, investigators found maps that placed him near the scenes of many unsolved disappearances. He had been staying in the suburb of Ryde, very close to where the girls lived, during that fateful January. Witnesses recalled a thin-faced youth speaking to the girls on the train, and Percy fit that description perfectly. Yet, throughout his 44 years in prison, he remained an enigma. Even as he lay dying of cancer in 2013, he refused to offer a confession. He took his secrets to the grave on the 23rd of July, leaving only degraded fragments of DNA that time had rendered silent. Other names have surfaced in the ripples of the investigation over the years. Christopher Wilder, later known as the Beauty Queen Killer, was once a teenager in Sydney with a history of violence on the local beaches. Some believed his brutality matched the nature of the Wanda Beach crimes, but he died in 1984 before he could ever be questioned. There was also the strange case of the painting titled A Bloody Awful Thing, created by Alan Bassett in prison. A detective was convinced the abstract landscape contained hidden details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. But that lead also faded into skepticism. Every path seemed to end in a cul-de-sac of sand and salt, leaving the families of the two girls to live in a state of perpetual longing, looking at the horizon for answers that never arrived. In the quiet corners of the cemetery in West Ryde, two headstones tell the story of a life interrupted. Marianne Schmidt's resting place bears the gentle words, "Asleep in Jesus." She was born on the 30th of October, 1948, and was just 15 years old when she disappeared into the dunes. Beside her is her best friend, Christine Mary Sharrock. Her inscription reads, "God had her in his keeping, we have her in our hearts." These girls were inseparable neighbors who shared the simple joys of youth before they were taken. Their families were left to navigate a world that felt significantly less safe, where the sun-drenched beaches had lost their innocence. The tragedy didn't just take two lives. It changed the way an entire nation viewed the safety of its own shores and its own children. Today, Wanda Beach is a place of peace and recreation once more. Families still picnic on the grass of the reserve, and surfers wait for the perfect break in the white-capped waves. The dunes are now a heritage-listed site, protected for their cultural and natural significance. But for those who know the history, the air at Wanda feels a little heavier. The wind still sighs through the coastal grass, and the sand still shifts, burying the past deeper with every passing year. The legacy of Marianne and Christine is not just one of tragedy, but one of endurance. They are remembered for the girls they were, full of life, forever young in the memory of a city that never stopped looking for them. As the tide comes in, we leave the dunes behind. The mystery remains, but the night is still. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.